What's up, Marvel fans? I'm Steven from the Hills Maniacs, and if you don't know, I've been doing a series of videos recently over the last couple of months where I've been talking about phases 4 and 5 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, specifically mostly the movies and some of the heroes and villains as well. The most recent one I talked about what I felt were the top 5 best villains introduced in phases 4 and 5, so these obviously were villains that were introduced in those two phases and have never been seen before in the MCU, didn't make like a return or anything like that. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about who I felt were the top 5 worst villains that were introduced in phases 4 and 5. But that's kind of the reason I was doing these videos, because I wanted to just take a look back at the previous two phases of the MCU as we lead into Avengers Doomsday, which comes out later this year. So go back and check out all the other videos I've done in this particular series, talking about the 5 best and 5 worst of different things in phases 4 and 5. So, without further delay, here are my picks for the top 5 worst villains introduced in the MCU phases 4 and 5. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, obviously phases 4 and 5 kind of kickstarted the whole Disney Plus series thing. Specifically, Phase 4, it started that whole thing. They had like WandaVision and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of these villains are going to be from those shows and also from some of the movies that were introduced. I think there were a lot more shows that were given to us during that time period than there were movies. So that's why most of these villains are probably going to be from some of the shows. And speaking of that, coming in first on this list at number 5 for me is Carly Morgenthau and the Flag Smashers from the Falcon and the Winter Soldier series. I did kind of like the idea of a group of people that have sort of been cast out basically because of the blip. Like they were erased from existence, and when they return, they find that their homes were taken over by other people because they've been gone for 5.5 years or sold by the government and that kind of thing. So it makes sense to have a group of people that are just trying to fight back against that and get their homes back and everything. It almost makes you sort of relate to it in a way, like what would you do in that scenario? Like you'd want your home back. But I don't think like in the long term they really did anything that was too threatening to like the overall story of the MCU and that kind of thing. Obviously they were meant to be a one-off group of villains anyways, just for this one specific show, but the premise of their whole agenda, I feel like, was an interesting concept for the MCU that you don't really think about after seeing, the aftermath of the blip and everything else. Like the MCU has shown us on a few occasions some of the ramifications of the blip, such as in Spider-Man, No Way Home and Far From Home and everything. We saw people blipping back into existence and how that affects things. We saw Yelena Belova blip in and out of existence. In that one scene in the Hawkeye series, just to kind of show what happened to certain people during that time and like what happened while they were gone and that kind of stuff. So having these kind of sympathetic and relatable villains that were mainly just fighting to get their homes back because they were kind of kicked out of their own homes because of the blip and everything, I thought that was something interesting, but just I feel like they could have done more with it, maybe. Like, they didn't really feel like villains necessarily. Like I said, they felt more like almost relatable, just humans. I mean, yeah, they did cause destruction and all that kind of stuff, and they were destroying government property and everything else. They did get a little bit carried away with it, but I still think on a human level, I feel like people would do this because, like, we want our homes back. Like, you need to figure this kind of thing out. And that was kind of the overall theme of the show, but I feel like they weren't really portrayed as villains necessarily, where they were like really menacing to society and that kind of thing. I almost feel like John Walker was more the villain than the Flag Smashers were, just because of his whole arc in that series where he's kind of consumed by being assigned to be Captain America and the pressure of being the new Captain America, and then he wants to take the super soldier serum, and of course he's also kind of crazy. So he kind of goes off and has anger issues and all that other stuff. He almost felt more like the villain in this than the Flag Smashers did, which is kind of what made me put them on this list. I didn't think they were necessarily overall like bad villains or anything. Like, they were kind of relatable, like I said, but in terms of like when you compare them to some other villains that were introduced in phases 4 and 5 and even before that, just throughout the overall MCU in general, I don't think they were really that threatening of a villain, but they weren't necessarily as bad as some of the other ones on this list, which I'll get into. But in terms of their villainy and all that kind of stuff, it felt like the right choice for the series. It just didn't feel like they were too villainy, I guess is how I would describe it. This next one coming in at number 4, I actually kind of grouped these together because they're both from the same show. So this show technically did have two villains, and that's the Clandestines and technically Department of Damage Control, or at least that one specific agent from Department of Damage Control in the Miss Marvel series. Obviously, Damage Control, the whole series, were basically the main antagonists. They were trying to hunt down Kamala Khan because they felt she was dangerous. That seems to be what their whole arc in the MCU is. They're tracking down these enhanced individuals or people that they feel are too threatening with superpowers. Like we saw that in the Wonder Man series and Spider-Man and all that kind of stuff. They're tracking down these individuals who they feel are a threat to society, and then seeing Miss Marvel gaining these powers, they kind of go after her for that reason. They did feel like the main antagonist, but honestly, I think it was like by the fourth episode even, the Clandestines are introduced, which is technically Kamala Khan's like family or her ancestors or something that have been trapped in a different realm all these years, trying to get back to Earth or trying to turn the Earth into their own realm and that kind of stuff. So that's where like you get that sort of like cosmic villains of the series along with Department of Damage Control. But I feel like having two different villains in the same series just kind of almost makes them clash with one another, like in terms of deciding which one is the actual villain of the series, and that kind of makes the plot a bit convoluted because it's like, who is Kamala Khan meant to be fighting here? Yeah, she's trying to avoid Department of Damage Control and fight the Clandestines, and that feels like too much for one hero to have to fight against, especially in her first outing as a superhero in the MCU. Like, this is the first time we're seeing Kamala Khan in the MCU, and so to have her facing two different villains like this, or at least two antagonists, because I wouldn't really consider Department of Damage Control like villains necessarily, but to have her going up against two antagonists instead of one just feels a bit too extreme in my opinion, and kind of pulled the plot in all different sorts of directions. And they did this with a couple different other shows and movies as well, where it almost felt like they couldn't decide on which villain they wanted or something, so they just threw both of them in there because they kind of had time, especially if it was a series, with like 6 episodes or 9 episodes, whatever. They can kind of do that and play around with that. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes that does work. Like, you look at the Daredevil series, he's facing off against like Kingpin and Bullseye and all these other villains all at the same time. But that plot all kind of makes sense and it all meshes well together because it all fits in with the same narrative. But in this case, I feel like they should have just stuck with either the Clandestines or the Department of Damage Control and just done the whole series based around one of them. The Clandestines were a bit more interesting because at least it made sense why they were trying to get Kamala's bangle and were trying to convince her to help them because they wanted to open the portal basically, or bring their realm onto Earth and like combine the two or whatever. So it was kind of, that's why they're considered villains, because Kamala wants to stop them from doing this. But also you have that whole family aspect and everything else with them, and that's how they're connected to Kamala Khan. And this kind of scheme for the villains is one that could have caused a lot of chaos in the MCU if they were able to pull that off. That could have caused incursions like we've seen, or at least something cosmic that like someone like Doctor Strange or somebody would probably have to take a look into. So it makes sense for Kamala to fight against something like that to stop that from happening. But then they're just kind of unceremoniously defeated basically, like close to the end of the series. And then she just faces off against the Department of Damage Control for the rest of the time. So that kind of took away from a more interesting villain group in the Clandestines compared to Department of Damage Control, because for whatever reason Marvel wanted to portray them more as this villainous group, which I can see what they're getting at by doing that. Like, they're making them probably the villains of the new mutant saga coming up. Like I've heard rumors of that where they might be like the sort of anti-mutant group that's chasing after the mutants to try and kill them. But I don't think they needed to really show that in this series about Kamala Khan. I think the clandestines were an interesting enough villain group where they could have just focused on them and it would have made sense to the story and just kind of kept the plot going. But because they threw two different villains in here, and we didn't get enough time to really learn who the clandestines are and that kind of stuff, they didn't have enough screen time, I guess. That's why I have them on this list, because I feel like we could have seen more from them, and maybe it would have been interesting. They would have been some of the best villains introduced in the MCU, but because they wanted to throw the Department of Damage Control stuff in there, I think Marvel kind of overdid it a little bit for this one series about this one hero. Coming in at number 3 for me is Crow and the Deviants from the Eternals movie. Now, say what you want, about the Eternals movie. A lot of people didn't really like it that much. It was crammed with a lot of exposition and backstory and everything else to where it's kind of hard to understand exactly. And for an introduction to these heroes, it has a lot of things that it throws at us all in one movie. So I can understand why people didn't really like the movie. But for me, the concept of there being these sort of android, almost like god figures in the MCU is kind of interesting. And the fact that there's deviants of those god-like beings, which in this case is the deviants and their leader Crow, I thought made for at least a compelling narrative if they had been able to tell that. But the problem, I think, was just the movie itself didn't really give us a lot of time to establish any villains because they had to throw all this stuff in there to teach us who the Eternals are and how they've been around so long and what they've been doing all this time and everything else. If we had gotten more time to learn about these villains and why they need to be destroyed and everything, I think it would have been a lot better of a movie and they would have been better antagonists. And again, this is another one of those examples where there was technically two villains, because you look at it, Icarus technically became the villain by the end of the movie because they're trying to stop the rise of the Celestial inside the Earth, and he's trying to prevent them from doing that, so he turns on the team. So it's kind of like they just threw out all this sort of deviant stuff in order to have him become the main antagonist by the end, by turning him evil against the team. There's not really much more I can say about them as villains. I just think it was just kind of generic because we didn't get enough time to settle into and learn about who the deviants are and why there's this deviant group of the Eternals basically that are out there and why they exist and everything else. If we had gotten more time to learn that, I think they could have been at least somewhat better villains than what they were. Coming in at number 2 for me is Dar-Benn from the Marvels. Now, I get that her whole villain arc in that movie is that she's going after Carol Danvers for what she did to the Kree and the destruction she caused by destroying the Kree and the Supreme Intelligence and everything else. And she wants to restore the Kree and bring their planet back to life and all that stuff because of what Carol did. All of that is fine and would have made for a really threatening villain if they had just maybe made this a Captain Marvel movie instead of bringing in Monica Rambeau and Kamala Khan into the mix and making it a team-up movie. Because it didn't really feel like she did much. I don't know if it was just the quality of the movie itself or what, but just in my opinion, I didn't feel like she really did too much in this movie to really be a threat. I feel like the biggest threat in the movie was the heroes having to deal with swapping places with each other every time that they used their powers. That was an obstacle that they had to fight against and eventually learn how to control, which took up a good chunk of the movie instead of us getting a little bit more time developing the villain and everything else. But the concept they were going for with this particular villain, I thought was alright. It made sense. A villain would do that sort of thing. Her motives made sense as a villain. I just feel like they didn't really, portray her that well or make her seem that menacing of a villain in this movie. The main focus of the movie was the dynamic between the three heroes instead of just being Dar-Ben versus Captain Marvel. Like, if this had just been a Captain Marvel sequel, I feel like maybe that would have been a decent concept and made it a pretty good movie. And it would tie in with the original Captain Marvel movie and the events that took place in that movie. It would have followed up with it to be like the perfect sequel for that. Like, I don't feel they really did anything to make her seem that interesting of a villain, in my opinion. And considering that it was basically 3-on-1, like her versus the three heroes, almost didn't even make it fair for her and make it seem like she's that threatening because she can easily be defeated by these three heroes. So that's kind of why she's this high up on this list, because they didn't really do a good job of making her that threatening of a villain, in my opinion. And finally, at number one, this might just be because of the show itself, but I picked Titania slash the Intelligentsia, I guess you can group those two together, from the She-Hulk series. Now, obviously everybody knows how bad the She-Hulk series turned out to be. It wasn't really that great of a show, and it was just it was almost basically stupid in a way, the whole plot of it. Now, first of all, the Intelligentsia, didn't really come in until like later in the series. Like, it was mostly focused on Titania, but I feel like the Intelligentsia was slightly more interesting because it was a group of people that we don't know that were trying to slander Jennifer Walters' name and, turn people against She-Hulk and that kind of stuff. And also they were trying to get her Hulk blood so that they could give it to themselves or whatever, basically, and make an army of Hulks and that kind of thing. That sort of thing feels like something interesting that a villain would do, and feels like it would fit right in on this kind of show about the cousin of the Hulk who accidentally gets Hulk's blood inside her and becomes a Hulk herself. That kind of thing would fit. But the whole Titania subplot with her, like, basically being a model that's also a superpowered individual that occasionally runs into Jennifer Walters and they have to fight each other all the time. She's basically her rival in a way rather than a villain. And then along the way too, you just have like individual episodes that don't really connect to each other necessarily. They're just courtroom drama sort of thing. Which I get that that's what they were going for because she is a lawyer, but they chose to have an overall villain of the series. I would say it's Titania because I think she was in more episodes, but I liked it when it started doing that whole mystery of who Intelligentsia was. It almost felt like a completely different show. Like, these people attack Jennifer Walters and try and get her blood, but she stops them, and then they continue to come after her and they slander her name on the internet and all that kind of stuff. Like, if they had just focused on that from the get-go, I feel like that would have been really compelling and maybe made the story a little bit better. And it could have maybe even tied in with the leader who was introduced in Captain America Brave New World. Like, that could have been one of his agendas that he's trying to accomplish, trying to get more Hulk blood to take over the world or something. That they could have tied into that as well. But again, like I said, with the Marvels, it was the quality of this series that really just kind of downgraded all the villains. I don't know if you can necessarily consider these two, Titania and Intelligentsia, to be the main antagonists of the series, but they were like threats that Jennifer had to fight against. But I just feel like overall across all of phases 4 and 5, they were the worst villains in the worst show that was introduced in phases 4 and 5 as well. And I don't think they're villains that anybody's really going to look back at or really remember. Like, we're probably not even going to watch the She-Hulk series. They might as well just retcon it out of existence at this point and maybe reboot it or something. So that's why they're at number one on this list. I feel like they're villains that, if we were to do an overall villain list across the entire MCU, I feel like they're like number one on the list of like worst ever, just because they don't really do anything, and especially since it's all erased at the end when Jennifer like erases the ending of the series herself and like rewrites it or something. I don't know how all that worked, but it was basically a cop-out ending in a way. So they basically undid everything that Intelligentsia did, and also Titania didn't really do anything either in the finale of the series. So it was all just a big mess of a show in general, but these villains like maybe could have been interesting if Marvel had done a different plot for the series. But there you go, guys. Those were my picks for the top 5 worst MCU villains introduced in phases 4 and 5. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Who did you think were the best and worst villains of the MCU from those two phases? And all those other things I talked about as well. What were the best and worst movies from phases 4 and 5 and the heroes? Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more, and go check out those other videos that I mentioned, as well as all other Marvel content we've uploaded on this channel as well, and anything else that we will do in the future, because I do love talking about Marvel stuff. But as always, thank you for watching the video, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.